I was pulling into my driveway after a 14-hour shift at the hospital when I saw the bright orange violation notice fluttering against my front door like some kind of diseased butterfly. The October wind in Scottsdale had picked up that evening, carrying the scent of desert sage and the promise of cooler nights. But all I could focus on was that garish piece of paper that seemed to mock me from 30 feet away. My scrub stuck to my back with dried sweat, and my feet ached in those compression socks that never quite did their job. All I wanted was to kiss my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, goodnight, grab a glass of wine, and collapse into bed. Instead, I found myself staring at a citation for unauthorized vehicle storage in violation of CCNR Section 47.2. What the hell, I muttered, yanking the notice free from the tape that held it to my burgundy front door. The violation was dated that same day, Tuesday, October 15th, and signed by Margaret Pemberton, president of the Saguaro Hills Homeowners Association. According to the notice, my commercial vehicle had been parked in my driveway for more than the allowable 24 hours, resulting in a fine of $250, due within 10 business days. I looked back at my Honda Pilot sitting exactly where I'd parked it 2 days ago when I'd started my stretch of back-to-back 12-hour shifts. The same Honda Pilot I'd been driving for 3 years. The same Honda Pilot that had never been considered a commercial vehicle by anyone with functioning brain cells. Mom, Emma, appeared in the doorway, her dark curls escaping from the ponytail my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had probably fixed for her after school. Are you okay? You look mad. I'm fine, sweetheart. I crumpled the notice and shoved it into my scrub's pocket. Just tired. Did you finish your homework? Mrs. Chen helped me with math, and I read for 30 minutes like you said. She wrapped her arms around my waist, and I breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. Are we in trouble? No, baby, we're not in trouble. I smoothed her hair and forced a smile. Go brush your teeth. I'll be up in a minute to say goodnight. But we were in trouble, and I knew it. Margaret Pemberton had been gunning for me ever since I'd opposed her proposal to ban children's toys from front yards during the August HOA meeting. She'd stood at that podium in the community center, her silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval, and declared that certain residents were turning our upscale community into a daycare center. I'd stood up from my folding chair in the back row, my voice carrying across the room, despite the knot in my stomach. Mrs. Pemberton, with respect, this is a family neighborhood. Children live here. They should be allowed to play in their own yards. Her pale blue eyes had locked onto mine with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps if certain residents maintained better control over their children's possessions, we wouldn't need such measures. The way she'd emphasized certain residents had made my cheeks burn. Emma's bike had been stolen from our front yard 2 weeks prior, and she'd had to leave her soccer ball and jump rope outside overnight, exactly once when I'd been called in for an emergency surgery. But Margaret spoke as if my 8-year-old daughter was single-handedly destroying property values. Now, staring at that ridiculous citation, I realized Margaret's targeting had escalated from passive-aggressive comments to active harassment. I tucked Emma into bed, reading her 3 chapters of Charlotte's Web until her breathing deepened and her grip on my hand relaxed. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and really examined the violation notice. The more I read, the angrier I became. The Honda Pilot was registered as a personal vehicle. I had the paperwork to prove it. More importantly, the CCNRs clearly stated that personal vehicles could be parked in driveways indefinitely, while commercial vehicles were restricted to 24 hours. Margaret had either misread the license registration, deliberately misrepresented the facts, or both. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor Jake Morrison, who lived 3 houses down and served as the HOA treasurer. Jake answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. Sarah, everything okay? It's almost 11. Sorry to wake you, but I need to ask you something. Did the board vote on any new parking restrictions recently? No, why we haven't had a board meeting since September. I heard rustling, probably Jake sitting up in bed. What's going on? I read him the violation notice word for word. The silence that followed stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Jake, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Sarah, this is... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Margaret can't issue fines unilaterally. Any violation has to be voted on by the full board, and the homeowner has to be given notice and an opportunity to respond before any fine is imposed. So, this is completely invalid. More than invalid, it's a violation of Arizona state law governing HOAs. Margaret could get the association sued. Jake's voice carried a note of worry that made my stomach clench. Listen, bring this to tomorrow night's board meeting. I'll make sure it's on the agenda. There's a board meeting tomorrow. Emergency session. Margaret called it this afternoon. She said there were urgent compliance issues to address. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air seeping through my kitchen windows. Jake, how many other people have received citations like this? I don't know. Margaret handles all the compliance documentation herself. She says it's more efficient than involving the whole board. He sighed. Sarah, I hate to say this, but I think you need to be prepared for a fight. After we hung up, I spent an hour researching Arizona HOA law on my laptop. What I found made my blood boil. Not only was Margaret's unilateral fine illegal, but homeowners had the right to request a hearing before the board, the right to legal representation, and the right to appeal any decision to the Arizona Department of Real Estate. I printed out the relevant statutes and highlighted the key passages. Then I composed a formal letter demanding the fine be rescinded and requesting a hearing before the full board. I wasn't about to let Margaret Pemberton bully me into paying $250 for the crime of parking my own car in my own driveway. The next evening, I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early, wearing my best navy blazer and carrying a folder thick with documentation. The meeting room smelled like industrial carpet and stale coffee, its fluorescent lights casting everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a table where the 5 board members would sit. Margaret was already there, of course, spreading papers across the table with military precision. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and her makeup was applied with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she'd once been very beautiful and refused to acknowledge that time had moved on. Mrs. Rodriguez, she didn't look up from her papers. I trust you're here to submit payment for your parking violation. Actually, I'm here to contest an illegal fine. I kept my voice level and professional. And to request a formal hearing before the board. Margaret's head snapped up, her pale eyes narrowing. Illegal. I think you misunderstand your obligations as a homeowner in this community. I understand them perfectly. I opened my folder and pulled out a copy of the CCNRs. Section 4.7.2 clearly states that personal vehicles may be parked in driveways without time restrictions. Commercial vehicles are limited to 24 hours. My Honda Pilot is registered as a personal vehicle. Your vehicle displays commercial markings. I stared at her. What commercial markings? The medical symbol on your rear window. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. The medical symbol she was referring to was a small decal I'd placed on my back window to identify myself as a healthcare worker during the early days of the pandemic. It was the size of a credit card and contained no company name, no advertising, no contact information. It was simply a blue cross with the word healthcare underneath. Mrs. Pemberton, that's not a commercial marking. It's a healthcare worker identification decal. Nevertheless, it identifies your vehicle as being used for commercial purposes. She shuffled through her papers and pulled out a photograph. As you can see, I have documented evidence of the violation. The photograph showed my Honda parked in my driveway taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The healthcare decal was barely visible, but Margaret had circled it in red marker and written commercial vehicle in block letters across the bottom. You were on my property taking photographs. I was on the public sidewalk documenting violations of community standards. Margaret's voice carried the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. As HOA president, I have the authority and responsibility to ensure compliance with our governing documents. Other board members began filtering into the room. Jake Morrison gave me a sympathetic look as he took his seat. Patricia Williams, the secretary, nodded politely. David Chen, Mrs. Chen's husband and the vice president, looked uncomfortable. Robert Sterling, The compliance committee chair avoided eye contact entirely. Before we begin tonight's meeting, Margaret announced once everyone was seated, I want to address the issue of certain residents who seem to believe they're above the rules that govern our community. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but forced myself to remain calm. Around me, about a dozen neighbors had gathered for the meeting, including Mrs. Patterson from next door and the young couple who'd moved in across the street last month, Mrs. Pemberton. I said, standing up, I've submitted a formal request for a hearing regarding the citation you issued. According to Arizona state law governing homeowners associations, I have the right to contest this fine before the full board. Margaret's smile was razor sharp. Mrs. Rodriguez, while I appreciate your enthusiasm for research, the board has already reviewed your case and determined that the fine is valid and appropriate. When Jake Morrison's voice cut through the tension. Margaret, we haven't had a board meeting to discuss any fines or violations. I conducted an email poll of the board members yesterday evening. The vote was unanimous to uphold the citation. I watched Jake's face darken. Margaret, you can't conduct official board business via email poll. Any vote has to be taken during a properly noticed public meeting. Jake, I think you're overcomplicating a simple compliance matter. Margaret's tone suggested she was addressing a particularly slow child. The violation is clear, the fine is appropriate, and Mrs. Rodriguez can either pay it or face additional penalties for non-compliance. David Chen cleared his throat. Margaret, I never received any email about voting on this fine. Patricia Williams nodded. Neither did I. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Perhaps there was an issue with the email system. Regardless, the violation stands. Actually, it doesn't. I pulled out my printed copies of the Arizona HOA statutes. Arizona Revised Statutes. Title 33. Chapter 16. Section 33, 1803 requires that homeowners be given written notice of any alleged violation and an opportunity to be heard before the board before any fine can be imposed. You issued a fine without following proper procedure. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Scottsdale Road. Margaret stared at me with unconcealed hostility, her carefully applied foundation unable to hide the flush creeping up her neck. Mrs. Rodriguez, are you questioning the authority of this board? I'm questioning your authority to issue fines without following the law. I kept my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. And I'm formally requesting that this fine be rescinded and that any future violations follow proper legal procedure. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. This board will not be lectured by residents who have no respect for community standards. Mrs. Rodriguez, your attitude tonight demonstrates exactly why strict enforcement is necessary. My attitude, I felt my professional composure slip in. Margaret, you trespassed on my property to take photographs, issued an illegal fine based on a healthcare worker decal, and then lied about board approval. My attitude is the least of your problems. The room erupted. Mrs. Patterson applauded from her seat near the wall. The young couple across the street whispered urgently to each other. Robert Sterling looked like he wanted to disappear into his folding chair. Order. Margaret banged a gavel against the table. I will have order in this meeting. Jake Morrison stood up. Margaret, as treasurer of this association, I'm formally requesting that you provide documentation of the board vote you claim authorized this fine. Jake, I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate being told I voted on something when I never received any communication about it. Jake's usual diplomatic demeanor had evaporated. Either produce the documentation or rescind the fine. Margaret gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. This meeting is adjourned. Mrs. Rodriguez, you have 7 days remaining to submit payment or additional penalties will be assessed. Margaret, you can't just adjourn the meeting. David Chen spoke for the first time since confirming he'd never received the alleged email. We have other business to discuss, and Mrs. Rodriguez has formally requested a hearing. The hearing is denied. The fine stands. Margaret stuffed her papers into a leather briefcase. Good evening. She walked out of the community center with her head held high, leaving the 4 remaining board members staring at each other in stunned silence. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Or Sarah, Jake said quietly. I think you need to file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. Will that help? It's a start, but honestly, Jake glanced toward the door Margaret had just exited. I think you need a lawyer. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Emma was already asleep, and Mrs. Chen was waiting with a cup of tea and a sympathetic expression. How did it go, dear? Not well. I sank into my kitchen chair and accepted the tea gratefully. Mrs. Chen, has Margaret ever targeted your family for violations? The older woman's expression grew troubled. David doesn't like me to talk about HOA business, but she glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. Last month, she cited us for having our trash cans visible from the street. We'd put them out at 6 in the morning for pickup, just like we have for 15 years. She took photographs at 5:30. That's insane. The fine was $100. David said it was easier to pay than fight. Mrs. Chen's voice dropped to a whisper. But Sarah, she's done this to others too. The Johnsons down the street, the new family, on Desert Vista Drive. Always small things, always with photographs, always with threats of additional penalties. I felt sick. How many people has she targeted? I don't know for sure, but David mentioned there have been at least 8 citations issued in the past 2 months, all of them for what he called questionable violations. After Mrs. Chen left, I sat at my kitchen table until well past midnight, researching Arizona HOA law and typing up a formal complaint to the Department of Real Estate. If Margaret thought she could intimidate me into backing down, she'd picked the wrong nurse. I'd dealt with surgeons throwing tantrums in operating rooms, family members screaming at me during medical emergencies, and administrators trying to cut corners on patient safety. One power-hungry HOA president wasn't going to scare me. But as I finally headed to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I was right. The next morning, I found another orange violation notice on my door. This one cited me for unauthorized outdoor storage and included a photograph of Emma's bike, which was parked next to our garage exactly where it had been for the past 6 months. The fine was $300. She's escalating, I told Jake over the phone while Emma ate breakfast. First the car, now Emma's bike. What's next? Sarah, this is harassment, pure and simple. Jake's voice was tight with anger. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tonight. Margaret doesn't have the authority to issue fines like this, and the rest of us need to put a stop to it. Will that work? It has to. If she keeps this up, the association could face serious legal liability. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I walked through the neighborhood looking for other violations that Margaret might have missed if she were truly concerned with uniform enforcement of community standards. What I found was enlightening. 3 houses down from mine, Robert Sterling, the compliance committee chair, had a boat parked in his driveway. According to the CCNRs, boats were prohibited from being stored in driveways for more than 72 hours. Robert's boat had been there for at least 2 weeks based on the layer of dust and the pile of mail that had accumulated on its windshield. 2 streets over, I found a house with Christmas decorations still up from the previous year, a violation of the seasonal decoration policy. Another house had a chain link fence that extended at least 2 feet beyond the property line into the community's green space. I took photographs of everything careful to stay on public sidewalks and document only what was visible from the street. If Margaret wanted to play the citation game, I'd show her how it was done properly. The emergency board meeting that evening was standing room only. Word had spread about Margaret's violation spree, and homeowners were angry. I recognized faces from around the neighborhood, including several people I'd never seen at HOA meetings before. Margaret arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, looking like she was dressed for a board meeting at a Fortune 500 company rather than a community center in suburban Scottsdale. She took her seat at the head table and banged her gavel exactly once. This meeting will come to order. I want to address the rumors and misinformation that have been circulating about recent compliance actions. And Margaret, Jake interrupted. Before we begin, I want to note for the record that this emergency meeting was called without your authorization, as provided for in our bylaws when 3 board members request it. Margaret's smile was ice cold. Jake, While I appreciate your attention to procedure, I am the president of this association, and I will conduct this meeting as I see fit. Actually, you won't. David Chen stood up a folder in his hands. Margaret, I'm formally requesting your resignation as president of this association. The room went dead silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her foundation. David, you're out of order. No, Margaret, you're out of order. David opened his folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. These are copies of all the violation notices you've issued in the past 60 days. 14 citations totaling over $3,000 in fines issued without board approval, without proper notice to homeowners, and without following any of the procedures required by Arizona state law. Patricia Williams stood up next. I second David's request for resignation. Margaret's gavel hit the table so hard I thought it might break. This is a coup. You people have no idea what you're doing. We know exactly what we're doing. Jake's voice was steady and calm. Margaret, you've violated your fiduciary duty to this association and exposed us to significant legal liability. Either resign tonight or we'll hold a vote of no confidence. I watched Margaret's face cycle through shock, anger, and something that looked almost like panic. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed to realize that her authority wasn't absolute. You can't force me to resign. I was elected by the homeowners, and we can be recalled by the homeowners. David pulled out another document. According to our bylaws, 15% of association members can petition for a recall vote. We already have signatures from over 40% of the neighborhood. Margaret looked around the room at the sea of hostile faces staring back at her. I saw her gaze linger on me, and for just a moment I saw something almost vulnerable in her pale blue eyes. Then her mask of arrogance snapped back into place. Fine, you want to destroy everything this association has built. Go ahead. She stood up and gathered her papers. But don't come crying to me when property values plummet and this neighborhood turns into a slum. Margaret, I stood up from my seat in the back row. Before you go, I have something for you. I walked to the front of the room and handed her a manila envelope. These are photographs of actual violations in our neighborhood. CCNR violations that have existed for weeks or months without any citations being issued. I thought you might want to review them for consistency in your enforcement policies. Margaret opened the envelope and flipped through the photographs. I watched her face change as she recognized Robert Sterling's boat, the Christmas decorations, the property line violations. When she looked up at me, her expression was pure venom. Mrs. Rodriguez, you seem to have a lot of time on your hands. I'm a single mother working 12-hour shifts to support my daughter. I don't have time for petty harassment campaigns. I kept my voice level and professional, but I do have time to ensure that HOA policies are enforced fairly and legally. Margaret shoved the photographs back into the envelope and looked around the room one final time. You people deserve each other. She walked out of the community center for the second time in as many days, but this time she didn't look quite so confident. The board voted unanimously to rescind all of Margaret's unauthorized citations and to implement new procedures requiring full board approval for any future violations. David Chen was elected interim president pending a formal election in 60 days. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. The harassment started 3 days later. I came home from work to find my mailbox had been vandalized with spray paint. The word troublemaker was scrawled across it in bright red letters. Emma saw it before I could shield her from it. Mom, why would someone write that? I don't know, sweetheart. Some people aren't very nice. I tried to keep my voice calm, but inside I was furious. Go inside and start your homework. I'll take care of this. I called the police and filed a report, but the officer who responded was not optimistic about finding the vandal. No witnesses, no cameras pointing toward your mailbox. Could have been kids, could have been someone with a grudge. You have any idea who might want to send you a message? I told him about the HOA situation, and he nodded knowingly. Yeah, we get calls about HOA disputes all the time. Usually stays civil, but sometimes. He shrugged. You might want to consider installing some security cameras. That weekend, I spent $600 I couldn't really afford on a doorbell camera and 2 additional security cameras for my front and backyards. Emma helped me position them, treating it like a fun project rather than a necessity born of intimidation. Will the cameras catch the bad guys, Mom? If there are any bad guys to catch, yes. I tightened the final mounting screw and stepped back to survey our work. But mostly they're just for peace of mind. On Monday evening, I found out we were going to need more than peace of mind. I was in the kitchen making dinner when Emma ran in from the backyard, tears streaming down her face. Mom, Mom, come look. Someone hurt Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers was Emma's orange tabby cat, a rescue we'd adopted 2 years earlier. He was an indoor-outdoor cat who spent his days sunning himself on our back patio and his evenings curled up on Emma's bed. I found him lying on our back patio conscious, but clearly in distress. His left hind leg was at an odd angle, and there were scratches along his side that looked deliberately inflicted. A veterinary emergency if I'd ever seen one. Emma, go get his carrier from the garage. We're taking him to the animal hospital right now. Dr. Martinez at the emergency clinic confirmed what I'd feared. Someone deliberately injured this cat. The leg fracture is consistent with blunt force trauma, and these scratches were made with a sharp instrument. I'm required by law to report suspected animal abuse to the authorities. The police officer who met us at the clinic was the same one who'd responded to the mailbox vandalism. Officer Rodriguez, no relation, despite the shared name, looked grim as he examined the photographs Dr. Martinez had taken of Mr. Whisker's injuries. Mrs. Rodriguez, this escalation is concerning. Vandalism is one thing, but animal cruelty is a felony in Arizona. He closed his notebook and looked directly at me. Do you feel safe in your home? I don't know, I admitted. Until tonight, I thought this was just petty harassment, but hurting my daughter's cat. I looked through the clinic window at Emma, who was sitting in the waiting room reading a book, to distract herself from worry. Officer, what if this person decides to escalate further? That's what I'm worried about. Let me ask you something. Do you have somewhere else you and your daughter could stay for a few days while we investigate? I shook my head. I have to work. Emma has school. This is our home. I understand, but I want you to be extra careful. Keep those security cameras running. Don't let your daughter play outside unsupervised and call 911 immediately if you see anything suspicious. Mr. Whiskers spent the night at the animal hospital with a surgically repaired leg and a collection of stitches. The vet bill was $800 money I didn't have, but charged to my credit card anyway. Emma cried herself to sleep that night, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of person would hurt an innocent animal to make a point. The next morning, I found my answer. I was reviewing the footage from my new security cameras when I saw a figure in dark clothing approaching my backyard gate at 3:15 in the morning. The person moved with purpose, carrying what looked like a metal rod or pipe. The footage was grainy due to the darkness, but when the figure turned toward one of the cameras, I caught a partial profile. Margaret Pemberton. My hands shook as I replayed the footage 3 times, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But the height was right. The build was right, and that rigid posture was unmistakably Margaret's. I'd watched her stand exactly that way during dozens of HOA meetings. I called Officer Rodriguez immediately. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is exactly the kind of evidence we need. Can you email me that footage right away? Of course, but what happens now? Do you arrest her? First, we enhance the video to get a clearer image. Then, we'll need to connect this footage to the animal cruelty, which means examining that pipe or rod for evidence. Do you see anything like that in your yard? I walked outside and searched the area where Mr. Whiskers had been injured. Behind our storage shed, partially hidden under a pile of autumn leaves, I found a small crowbar with what looked like cat hair stuck to one end. Don't touch it, Officer Rodriguez said when I called him back. We're sending a crime scene technician to collect it as evidence. While I waited for the police, I called Jake Morrison. Sarah, are you serious? Margaret attacked your cat? The video shows someone who looks like Margaret in my backyard at 3 a.m. with what appears to be the weapon we found. Jake, this has gone way beyond HOA disputes. Jesus Christ. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, I owe you an apology. When you first started pushing back against Margaret, part of me thought you were being overly dramatic. I should have realized she was capable of something like this. None of us thought she'd resort to animal cruelty. But, Jake, I need to ask you something important. Has Margaret ever made threats about residents who opposed her, not directly, but Jake paused. There was something she said during a closed board session last month. She was talking about residents who didn't understand their place in the community hierarchy. She said some people needed to be taught lessons about respect and consequences. Oh, did she mention me specifically? She mentioned the nurse with the problematic attitude. Sarah, I should have told you about this conversation earlier. After the crime scene technician collected the crowbar and additional video footage, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and tried to process what was happening. A woman I'd known only through HOA meetings, a woman I'd never personally insulted or threatened, had escalated a dispute over parking violations to the point of breaking into my yard and torturing my daughter's pet. Emma came downstairs for breakfast, her eyes still red from crying. Is Mr. Whiskers going to be okay? He's going to be fine, sweetheart. Dr. Martinez says he can come home tomorrow. I pulled her into a hug and breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. Emma, I need to tell you something important. The person who hurt Mr. Whiskers might be someone we know, and the police are going to catch them. Who would hurt a cat, Mom? I don't know, baby. Some people make very bad choices when they're angry. I held her tighter. But you don't need to worry about it. Okay, the police are handling everything. But I was worried. If Margaret was willing to sneak into my yard and attack my cat, what else might she be willing to do? And how long would it take the police to build a case against her? I got my answer that afternoon. Officer Rodriguez called just as I was leaving the hospital after my shift. Mrs. Rodriguez, we've enhanced the security footage and we have a positive identification. We also found DNA evidence on the crowbar that matches your cat. We're issuing an arrest warrant for Margaret Pemberton. Went tonight. We've been watching her house, and she appears to be packing like she's planning to leave town. We're moving now to prevent flight risk. I felt a mixture of relief and residual anger. What charges? Animal cruelty, criminal trespass, criminal damage, and intimidation. If convicted on all counts, she's looking at up to 3 years in prison and significant fines. That evening, Jake Morrison called with an update. Sarah, they arrested Margaret at Sky Harbor Airport. She was trying to board a flight to her sister's house in Florida. So she knew the police were closing in, apparently. But here's the thing. When they searched her house with the warrant, they found a whole collection of surveillance photos. Not just of your house, but of at least a dozen other properties in the neighborhood. Photos taken from various angles at different times of day with notes about potential violations. I felt sick. She was stalking the entire neighborhood. It gets worse. They also found a spreadsheet on her computer with names, addresses, and what she called compliance priority levels. Your name was at the top of the list marked as Phase 1 enforcement, escalate as necessary. Phase 1. What was Phase 2? According to the spreadsheet, Phase 2 was property damage and safety concerns. Phase 3 was personal consequences. Jake's voice was grim. Sarah, I don't think the cat was going to be her final escalation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Margaret hadn't just been harassing me over HOA violations. She'd been planning a systematic campaign of intimidation that could have escalated to what damage to my car, my house, threats against Emma. Jake, how long had she been planning this? Based on the computer files, at least 3 months. The earliest surveillance photos were taken in July, right after you opposed her toy ban proposal. I sat down heavily on my couch, suddenly exhausted. 3 months of planning to terrorize neighbors over homeowners association disputes. There's more, Sarah. The police found similar spreadsheets for other residents who'd opposed her in the past. The Johnsons moved away last spring after what they called ongoing harassment from a neighbor. The Martinez family on Desert Vista Drive stopped coming to HOA meetings after Margaret cited them for violations 3 weeks in a row. She drove them away. Or tried to. You're the first person who fought back hard enough to expose what she was really doing. Mr. Whiskers came home the next day with a cast on his leg and a cone around his head to prevent him from licking his stitches. Emma showered him with attention, building a comfortable nest of blankets in her bedroom and reading to him from her chapter book. The vet says he's going to make a full recovery. I told my neighbors who'd gathered on my front lawn to check on us. Word of Margaret's arrest had spread quickly through the community, and the response had been overwhelmingly supportive. Mrs. Chen brought homemade soup. The young couple from across the street offered to watch Emma anytime I needed help. Even Robert Sterling stopped by with an apology and an offer to pay for the veterinary bills. I should have spoken up when I saw how Margaret was targeting certain residents, he said, looking genuinely ashamed. I was afraid she'd turn her attention to me if I opposed her. Robert, she had surveillance photos of your boat parked in your driveway. You were already on her target list. His face went pale. She, what? The police found photos of violations at your house and others. Margaret wasn't enforcing community standards, she was collecting ammunition to use against anyone who crossed her. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Margaret's harassment campaign became clear. The police investigation revealed that she'd been conducting surveillance on over 20 households in the community, documenting minor violations and planning escalating enforcement actions. Her computer contained detailed profiles of residents she considered problematic, including personal information she'd gathered from social media property records and neighborhood gossip. The prosecutor assigned to the case called it one of the most extensive stalking and harassment cases she'd seen in a residential community. Margaret's trial was scheduled for March, but she accepted a plea bargain in February. She pleaded guilty to animal cruelty, criminal trespass, and intimidation, receiving 18 months in prison followed by 3 years of probation. Part of her plea agreement included a permanent restraining order preventing her from entering our neighborhood and a requirement to pay restitution for Mr. Whisker's medical bills and the damage to my mailbox. More importantly, for the community, the case prompted a complete overhaul of the HOA's governing procedures. We implemented new bylaws requiring transparency in all enforcement actions, mandatory board votes for any citations, and clear appeals processes for homeowners. Jake Morrison was elected as the new president, running on a platform of reasonable governance and respect for residents' rights. Emma and I attended the community meeting where the new bylaws were approved, sitting in that same community center where Margaret had tried to intimidate me into paying illegal fines, watching dozens of neighbors vote for fair and transparent HOA procedures. I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Are we safe now, Mom? Emma asked as we walked back to our car. Yes, sweetheart, we're safe. And we were. The security cameras stayed up partly for peace of mind, and partly because they'd proven their value. Mr. Whisker's leg healed completely, though he never quite lost his wariness of unexpected noises in the backyard. The neighborhood settled into a rhythm of reasonable governance and mutual respect. But the experience taught me something important about standing up to bullies. Margaret Pemberton had counted on intimidation and fear to maintain her power. She'd assumed that busy working parents like me would find it easier to pay unjust fines than to fight back. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd been right about one thing. Fighting back required courage, persistence, and a willingness to escalate when necessary. 6 months later, I received a letter from the Arizona Department of Real Estate commending our HOA for implementing exemplary governance procedures and citing our case as a model for other communities dealing with board overreach. The letter noted that our new bylaws had been shared with HOAs across the state as an example of how to balance community standards with residents' rights. I framed that letter and hung it in my kitchen right next to Emma's school photos and Mr. Whisker's brave patient certificate from the veterinary clinic. Sometimes the smallest victories are worth celebrating, especially when they come at the cost of standing up to people who believe power means never having to follow the rules themselves. The experience also connected me with neighbors I'd barely known before. Mrs. Chen and I became close friends, bonding over our shared experience with Margaret's harassment. Jake Morrison and I served together on the new governance committee, working to ensure our community remained a place where families could thrive without fear of arbitrary enforcement or personal vendettas. Emma learned lessons too, though I tried to shield her from the worst details. She learned that sometimes adults behave badly, that it's important to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult, and that communities work best when people look out for each other. She also learned that cats are resilient, that security cameras can catch bad guys, and that her mom will always fight to protect their home and their family. On quiet evenings when Emma is doing homework and Mr. Whiskers is purring in his favorite spot by the window, I sometimes think about what might have happened if I'd just paid that first illegal fine. Margaret would have moved on to her next target emboldened by success. Other families would have faced the same harassment, the same escalating intimidation, the same choice between fighting back and giving in. I'm grateful I found the courage to fight back, not just for Emma and me, but for all the neighbors who deserve to live in peace without fear of retribution for imaginary violations. Margaret Pemberton taught our community an important lesson about the difference between legitimate authority and personal vendetta, even if it wasn't the lesson she'd intended to teach. Standing up to bullies isn't easy, especially when they hide behind official titles and claim to represent community standards. But sometimes it's the only way to protect not just yourself, but everyone around you who might be next on their list. This is a dramatized story inspired by common HOA disputes, not legal advice.